Welcome to the Business of Story, brought to you by Sendable, the online social media management platform that helps more than 3,000 digital agencies streamline their online storytelling planning, engagement, and reporting. I'm Park Howell, and I'm so happy you're with us today. As we battle through what may be the first grueling round of the coronavirus that has made everything in our lives uncertain, one thing is for sure. We all are negotiating our way through this challenge. You may be negotiating with your kids at home to do their homework and try to remain quiet while you do your work. You negotiate what Netflix show to binge watch with your spouse or partner. You're negotiating pricing with your clients. You may be negotiating to retain your ability to continue to work from home as business starts reopening. You may be negotiating a salary raise or cut, a career move, or even trying to land that new job during these disruptive times. Show note here, I recorded this episode about a month before COVID descended upon all of us, and it's been sitting in the green room ever since because I've been spending time interviewing thought leaders on their response to COVID. But I think now is a great time to share today's guest with you, to help you sharpen your negotiating skills and how storytelling comes into play in every single deal you make. You will learn the 5 golden rules to help you win the day every time you sit down to that negotiating table, and you are going to learn it from a worldwide negotiation expert, Marty Latz. He states that we negotiate every day, yet most of us negotiate instinctively and don't give the process the strategic attention it deserves. And guess what? We suffer as a result. This is the same concept I explore with storytelling. We all, as Homo sapiens, are instinctual storytellers, but unless you become intentional about how you tell a story, you'll typically default back to features, functions, data, and numbers. Numbers. Marty Latz says the same thing happens when you negotiate. If you want to land the best deal, then you need to show up practiced and prepared. And that's exactly what we'll cover today. Good Morning America anchor George Stephanopoulos has called Marty Latz one of the most accomplished and persuasive negotiators I know. The founder of Latz Negotiation, a national negotiation training and consulting firm, Latz also taught negotiation as an adjunct professor of law at Arizona State University's College of Law from 1995 to 2005. Since then, he has taught over 100,000 lawyers and business professionals around the world how to more effectively negotiate and has negotiated for the White House nationally and internationally on its advanced teams. Mr. Latz is the author of Gain the Edge, Negotiating to Get What You Want, and his new book, The Real Trump Deal, an eye-opening look at how Trump really negotiates. He's also appeared as a negotiation expert on CBS, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, and has been cited in USA Today, Political, The Economist, and many, many other publications. Mr. Latz received his law and negotiation training at Harvard Law School, where he graduated cum laude and was a teaching fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where one of his students was, wait for it, former President Barack Obama. So let's dial up your storytelling chops to win in your next negotiations with today's guest, Marty Latz. Marty, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
I am so glad you're here. This is just such an interesting topic, using storytelling in negotiations. And really, aren't we all negotiators daily in our lives, whether it's negotiating something with our spouse or our family or with our clients and our friends? Doesn't it always come down to some sort of negotiation skill?
Well, that's right. That's a fundamental element of how we interact with other human beings. Anytime that you're discussing something with someone and you have interest to satisfy and they're having a conversation with you, you're both trying to get your interest satisfied. And whether you consider it a formal negotiation or just trying to work something out in an informal way, you're negotiating.
So, Marty, your backstory. Can you take us to a time or a moment when you were, I don't know, a kid or a young man, and you can look back at it and say, aha, that was one of the moments, if not the moment, that has shaped who I am today and have followed this career in being a negotiator, a negotiation guru in America?
Well, I'm going to take you back almost 30 years to in the middle of law school. I was taking a course from really the father of the negotiation industry these days, a guy named Roger Fisher, who co-wrote Getting to Yes, which is really the classic in the industry, at least for a few more years until my first book's been out there a little bit longer.
Okay.
No, seriously, I was taking this course from Fisher, and I thought I had been fairly successful up until that point and some of my negotiations. And I found and realized in that course that even though I thought I was pretty good, that there was a lot of science and study and research on this. And it particularly struck home to me within the context of a very challenging personal negotiation in which I had just gone through at that time. My girlfriend at the time had broken up with me, and I really didn't understand what happened. And so we actually replayed that in our negotiation course. We videotaped it. I was able to look at the videotape, and I began to get a sense as to what all the challenges were that I had faced in that relationship slash negotiation. And it really, as you say, it really brought up an aha moment to me in the sense that I realized that there was just an incredible amount of learning and improvement that I could personally do. And I also really began to more fully appreciate that this is a life skill and that it was something that we can all get better at and improve, and that it will, if we do so, have a huge impact in almost all parts of our lives, not only in the business context, maybe you're buying a business, maybe you're investing in a company, but also in the personal context. My most challenging ongoing negotiation is with my wife. My second most challenging negotiations are with my 14-year-old son and my 10-year-old daughter. And then the business negotiations come in. But that really was the biggest aha moment to me, because I realized that you can and you should learn about this and improve. Don't just do it instinctively or intuitively. Start to do it more strategically based on the experts' proven research.
So you're in law school. She breaks up with you. Were you trying to negotiate getting back together with her? And then you realized that maybe there was a shortcoming that you weren't recognizing at the time that this brought out?
You know, that really wasn't an option at the time. And
Uh-huh.
one of the things I came to realize as we sort of unpacked that dynamic is that we probably were not right for each other long term, anyways. And that in part related to some of the lack of communication and negotiation skills that I had at the time.
I got you. So were you in law school just kind of exploring what your career was going to be, and then you found that negotiation was of particular interest to you? Or how did that come about where it's become such a core focus for you?
Well, you know, I wanted to be a trial lawyer, and obviously negotiation is a major component of all lawyers, whether you're a business lawyer helping someone buy or sell a company, close a deal, or if you're a litigator and you're negotiating settlements, or if you're a trial lawyer and maybe you're just negotiating for information that you can use at the trial. But what I found when I came out and started practicing law after law school, I started to really get into the nitty gritty, and I started to see how you can start to implement these strategies and tactics. And then I got to know a full-time law professor at Arizona State who realized that I had this particular interest in negotiation. He hired me to teach the negotiation course at the law school. I started teaching it as an adjunct just a couple of nights a week, and I absolutely loved the teaching. And then all of a sudden, a law firm asked me if I'd do a training program for them, and then a business asked me to do a training program for them. And I thought, you know what? Let me give it a shot. I love teaching. I enjoyed practicing law, but I didn't love it. And I started teaching and training. That was in 1998. and I've been doing that full time ever since. I do about 75 programs a year all over the place. I'm going to Dublin in a couple of months. And I also started writing and researching and really putting my mind into the research as well. My first book came out in 2004. My second book came out about a year and a half ago. So I feel very fortunate. I have found a passion in a niche, and I absolutely love what I do. And hopefully I'm helping people accomplish their goals and objectives as well.
Absolutely. Well, we have that adjunct teaching at ASU in common because I did that same thing from 2013 through 2018, playing off of my work in branding and advertising marketing. And I went and worked at the School of Sustainability, created a curriculum around storytelling, sustainable storytelling, and how do you get people to buy into causes and beliefs and actually move them to action, and had just a pleasure. I mean, the absolute honor of working with executives from around the world that came in for this master's course. So I feel you. I know what you mean, how much fun it is to coach and teach and bring these skills to executives who are otherwise quite accomplished in one area, but they just haven't been exposed to, negotiating skills and storytelling. And that's why I have you here today. Can you tell us how you found the power of story to work so well in negotiating, and maybe give us some tips on how you use story or teach story in negotiations?
Sure. Well, there's no question that if you can tie a story, an example in a training program, in a coaching or a consulting role, or in an actual frontline negotiation, if you can tie a story to the point you're trying to get across, that it really changes how the recipient or your counterpart can perceive it, understand it, and oftentimes implement it. So, for instance, in my training programs, I really try to provide an example or a story for each discrete strategy or tactic that I'm teaching. So, for instance, I talk at the beginning of my programs, I have what I call the 5 golden rules in negotiation. As part of the first golden rule, information is power, so get it. I talk about the need to set your goals and to know your objectives. And I know, Park, you fully appreciate this because you oftentimes have to have a goal when you're doing any type of consulting or coaching. And the story I use to illustrate that comes from one of the founders of Sony Corporation, who in 1955 had an opportunity to sell 100,000 transistor radios here in the United States through Bulova. Now, in 1955, Sony was virtually unknown outside of Japan, and the deal was they were going to sell this new innovative electronics product, this transistor radio, to Bulova, which had a great reputation, which had a great retail distribution network throughout the United States. And the founder of Sony, Akio Morita, was going to do this deal. So he goes to Sony's board. He suggests, here's the opportunity. What do you think? Sony's board basically all said, do the deal. It's a win-win deal, right? It takes advantage of our strength, this innovative new electronics product. It takes advantage of Bulova's strength, their retail distribution network. We'll sell it to Bulova, stamp the Bulova name on it, and of course, distribute it throughout the United States. Now, Park, this was a huge deal for Sony. In fact, it was worth several times Sony's working capital from the previous few years. So Sony's board said, do the deal. Well, Morita took about 2 weeks to think about it. He then rejected the deal with Bulova against the advice of his board. Why did he reject the deal with Bulova? Because it had the Bulova name on it. Because Morita's long-term strategic goal was not just to exponentially increase his profits over the next 2, 3, 5 years. It was over the next 50 years to get the Sony brand name out there as consistent and synonymous with innovative new electronics products, right? So, Park, as you can see, what we do in teaching it and what I do when I talk about it in my consulting and coaching is you've got to tie the story to the strategic or tactical component. Absolutely crucial to do that. Now, I recently asked about the application of stories into my world. We recently bought a new SUV for our family. And, we're talking to a number of sales folks, and they're really trying to get us to experience this SUV or the various SUVs we were looking at. So stories have an absolutely huge application and impact and relevance in all negotiations.
Now, did you have one salesman do a better job of sharing a story with you than another?
I did. I was quite interested because one of the things that I did is I tried to do most of the early negotiations over the phone because I didn't want the sales folks to really completely control the agenda in that context. And they had various strengths and weaknesses, and you start to see that not only in their phone personality and the stories and the examples that they share, but also when you actually go to the dealership and get an opportunity to ride around in these cars with them. Varying levels of sophistication, knowledge, stories, examples from some of these different folks. In fact, I'm engaged in a negotiation right now to look at maybe put some solar panels on our house. And one of the things that one of the sales guys did is he did a little bit of his research, which I also teach, before he even picked up the phone and called me back. Found out that I was a negotiation expert, and that gave us both a little bit of a chuckle as we started out our conversation.
Well, and it gave you a connection point too. So a really smart move on his part. Yeah.
Very smart move. One of about 5 that I discussed this with that had done his homework and done his research to that degree.
Why do you think stories work versus just getting up and stating your fact or opinion or an assertion on something? What is it about stories that helps sort of soften the beachhead, if you will, in that negotiation?
I think it operates on several different levels, Park. I think probably the element that is perhaps most important is allows us to connect with other human beings, and they are humans, right, on a very emotional, psychological level. And just the facts are not, they'll allow you to connect on an intellectual level, but it's not going to hit at the heart, at the being, at the shared experience that you might have. And that's really the second part. One is that sort of emotional and psychological element. And two, maybe that story will connect and hit home with the other person because they've experienced something similar in their past. It will also, perhaps the third reason would be it makes it easier for people to remember and to implement those strategies and tactics. So you may not remember when I said set your goals, but you're probably going to remember that example of Ikea Morita. You may not remember his name, but you'll remember that he really had that long-term branding goal in mind. And so when you need to set your goal in your negotiation, it may trigger that memory, and that will trigger the change strategy and tactic that you will hopefully implement when you put together your strategic negotiation plan.
I got you. So you had just covered golden rule number 1 from your first book, which is gaining the edge, negotiating to get what you want, which I think came out in 2004. So that's been around for a while.
That's exactly right. Been around for a while. That's why I'm hopeful that at some point it'll become the classic, right?
Well, can you take us through a couple of these other golden rules in the book? You have golden rule 2, maximize your leverage. Now, how do you use story to do that?
Well, oftentimes it's interesting that you use story in the context of everything. You can use story oftentimes. You have to be very careful about using story in the context of leverage because it is not only the most powerful part of the negotiation, but it can also be the scariest part, especially if you anticipate and want a future relationship with the other side. Let me give you a sense of what it means, and then maybe we can talk about how stories can be utilized within that context. So
Terrific.
There are 2 elements of leverage in most negotiations. First is how much you need a deal relative to how much the other side needs a deal. The more desperate you are for the deal, the weaker your leverage. The more desperate they are, the stronger your leverage. So it's a relative concept. The second element of leverage is what are you going to do if you don't do a deal with the other side? In Getting T.S., Fisher and Urey, the co-authors of that book, called it your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement with the other side. What are you going to do if you don't do a deal with with them, right? Your plan B. And what are they going to do if they don't do a deal with you, right? So if I do a deal with one car dealer, my alternative is doing a deal with another car dealer, right? So it's my alternative. The better your alternative, the stronger your leverage. So the question now becomes, how do you use stories and examples in that particular context? Well, you can do it in a number of ways. It might be a sort of shorthand way of sharing, hey, I'm not desperate to do this deal. I mean, you may show, share an example or a story of a previous negotiation that you did where you walked away from the deal as a way to illustrate the fact that you're not desperate, that you can walk away. On the other hand, you might also share a story relating to the way that you and your counterpart can satisfy your interests, and you maybe don't have that good an alternative, especially if you care about a future relationship with the other side. You may not want to share a story about where you walked away. You may want to share a story on how two similarly situated parties really reached agreement in that particular context. So I might share a story, for instance, if I am working to get a raise and I'm talking to my manager, I might talk about how, one of my colleagues at another company had an opportunity to get some additional support internally for them to accomplish their business objectives, and how that was an example of a creative way to work out a deal as opposed to simply saying, hey, I got an offer from another company and I really need a little bit more cash to stay here.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It totally does. So what you're saying then is, if you are, or when you are going into a negotiation, you have to be so strategic as to walk through these rules and really consider what you want at the end of all of this, and then start really stockpiling your stories on how you're going to share them. And I would imagine you've got to have a couple, 3 different stories for maybe ready to be queued up for each one of these rules, just depending on how the negotiation goes. So one story you may have thought before you started was going to be really powerful, you actually shelve and you go to a different story depending on how the negotiation is going.
Park, you put your finger on something that's so crucial in the negotiation world, is you've got to do that type of preparation, right? You've got to come with those examples, and you don't have to remember all this stuff. What I recommend is that people actually develop strategic written negotiation plans. And what you're suggesting is, let's not just have a goal, but let's stockpile a couple of stories or examples that we can use to illustrate why it's in their interest to accept maybe what you've put on the table in the first place. And I think that's a really powerful way to do it. Of course, most people, they're sitting at their desk, the telephone rings, they look at the caller ID, it's their counterpart. What do? They just pick it up. They just jump right in. They just do it. They wing it, right? But what you're suggesting, and I 100% agree with you, is that you need to prepare. You need to have a plan, and you need to stockpile some stories that illustrate some of the points that you want to make and the strategies and tactics you want to implement in that negotiation.
When you say story, how do you define a story? So for instance, when I am coaching and teaching on this, and I learned this from the great guys at Anecdote out in Melbourne, Australia, they teach primarily oral storytelling, and really all negotiation you're talking about is oral storytelling. I know you've got an article written that says put down the text, put down the email, even put down the phone and see if you can't get in front of them. That's your most powerful form of negotiation, right? So
some of them. I mean, there are, what I suggest in a lot of cases is you need to be strategic about how you communicate relative to what you want to accomplish in that negotiation. Sometimes you want to, make a written offer. Sometimes you want to pick up the phone. Sometimes you may want to, fly halfway around the world for a 1-hour meeting. You've got to be strategic about what you want to accomplish in that setting, and then design how you engage to accomplish that.
Thank you for clarifying that for me, because I was thinking it was much more in person, but I can see your point there. when you're looking for a story, you don't want them to be, I suppose, long and involved and take a lot of time. You've got to get to that business point so that you're not frustrating the person on the other side of the table from you. And so we look at these little anecdotes, which are broken down to a timestamp in this story. It seems to just hook the primal mind of your Homo sapiens audience sitting across from you. You know, when did this story occur? Where did it occur? Who is the central figure that your audience can relate to in this story? You're not talking about a bunch of different people. You're talking about an individual, an action that took place, and a surprise that comes out of that action that ultimately creates the aha moment or the business point that you're trying to underscore. So that's what I coach. Do you have a similar approach when you are coaching your students on how to spot, capture, and share these stories in the wild?
Well, I haven't broken it down the way that you have, but that sounds very detailed and specific and strategic. And I may steal some of that if that's okay. Oftentimes I'm focusing on the strategy or the tactic they should use in the negotiation, and I'm recommending that one way to further empower the implementation of that and the impact of that is to share a story. But I haven't really gone into the science of storytelling to the extent, obviously, that you have. I love the way you broke that down into really its component parts, because that's really, in short, what I'm teaching on the negotiation side as well.
And again, I got that from my friends Mark Shank and Sean Callahan of Anecdote. And Sean's got a great book out that if you haven't read, you might enjoy, called Putting Stories to Work. And it's oral storytelling in business, which of course is always negotiation. And
Right.
it breaks them down to those little components. I've found them to be very successful. And I guess for our listeners too, so many of them, I mean, we're negotiating every day, but we're not thinking of ourselves as professional negotiators. Yet I would argue, whenever you're writing that blog post or putting together that video, or you're standing on stage and you've got a presentation to make to a crowd or in a boardroom, even that presentation, as you're delivering it, are setting up a negotiation, because you are typically asking your audience to do something. You're
Right.
trying to shake them out of status quo and move them somewhere. So even though it's not a debate and it's not a back and forth, you're not buying an SUV or a new home or trying to land that big deal. You are trying to get them to buy into something. And essentially, that's a negotiation.
I think that's a really important part, because when I write a monthly negotiation column that was carried for many years by the Arizona Republic, and now it goes out to a bunch of folks that have attended my programs in the past. That's a negotiation between myself and my readers. And in a sense, our conversation today is a negotiation between us and them. Right? Because we have interests, we want to satisfy, we want to share information, and we want them to take that information and put it into practice in their business dealings. And if you take a look at the columns I've written, I really make a pretty conscious effort to always tie the strategy to a story, to an example. I start out with a quote, or I start out with something else, and I try to wrap the strategy into something that's going to connect with folks in an emotional, psychological way. By the way, anyone who is interested in signing up for that column, and Park, if you'll excuse my blatantly commercial effort here, they can sign up directly at our website at Latz, Latz negotiation.com.
No,
there's my little commercial.
happy to do that, and we'll cover that again at the end of the show, and we'll have that in the link in the show notes too, because your
Thank you.
content is really fantastic. So we covered golden rule number 1 and 2, information is power, and maximize your leverage. What is golden rule number 3?
Golden rule 3 is employ fair objective criteria. It's the element of a negotiation where you want to put that fair and reasonable hat on your head, because the terms fair and reasonable or unfair, unreasonable really don't mean anything except as they are tied to or supported by some standard, some independent objective criteria. It is fair for you to sell this company for X because the market value is X, or because they had this amount of profit last year, or because someone in a similar industry played for a similar company this, right? So you've got market value, precedent, you've got some expert who is sharing it. And in this particular context, it's really important to share stories or examples of how those standards apply in your particular context. And just to take the perhaps, and I don't want to get into politics here, but if you take a look at the negotiation going on in the U.S. Senate right now in the impeachment trial, you're hearing a lot from both sides about what's unprecedented or what's a fair trial. And what we need to do in any negotiation is go down to that next level. It's fair or reasonable because. And you get different arguments and you get different standards, but you've got to go and drive down and drill down and get to those standards.
Well, since you mentioned it, and of course the impeachment is a negotiation, how do you think the Democrats did, and how do you think the Republicans are doing? Because as of this recording, we, I think, are in day 3 of the Republican or the House legal team making their case.
You know, I think that that both sides are doing a pretty good job. It's so difficult to evaluate what's going on if you're not there. I will point out, however, that I think the Democrats probably did a better job of telling the overall story purely from a tactical perspective. And the reason is not because I agree with them or disagree with them, but I think their presentations in terms of the videos, the examples, the framework in which they shared it just seemed to me to hit home a little bit more emotionally and psychologically purely from a presentation perspective. On the other hand, if you take a look at the Republican side, they've had a very clear, straightforward narrative and goal, and they've been very, very efficient in terms of that presentation as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we're going to talk about your book, The Real Trump Deal, in a minute, because I'm fascinated about what you found in that. Let's just cover real quick the last 2 golden rules. So golden rule number 4 is design an offer concession strategy. So does that mean like, here's my offer, but I have to have that plan B, that if you're not going to accept it, I will accept this other thing?
Well, that's a part of it. You know, the offer concession strategy, which is, by the way, what sometimes people think of as the entire negotiation, is really just a part of it. The issue there is, do you make a first offer, or do you try to get the other side to make a first offer? When you make a counter offer,
what in your experience, what's the best?
I'm going to give you a great legal answer to that question.
Okay.
It depends. Sometimes you want to make a first offer. Sometimes you want to try to get the other side to make a first offer. Sometimes you negotiate over who makes the first offer, and you should. There are advantages and disadvantages. The biggest advantage to making a first offer is that it sets expectations. First time you meet someone, first impression, disproportionate impact on what they think of you. First offer, disproportionate impact on what they think of the move. Biggest disadvantage to making a first offer is you don't have enough information to appropriately set it. One story or example that relates to this goes way back in our history to Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison invented the stock ticker device a number of years ago that brokerage houses used for many, many years. And he's trying to figure out how much to sell this device for. And he figures that he'll ask for $5,000, but push comes to shove, he'll accept $3,000. That was his bottom line, $3,000. So he's meeting with General Lefferts, the president of the Golden Stock Telegraph Company. Lefferts said to Edison, hey, tell me what you're selling this device for, right? I mean, inventors traditionally name their price. Well, Edison said in his book that he was too embarrassed to ask for $5,000. So he fumbles around a little bit, and he finally said to Lefferts, what are you willing to offer? Mark, you want to guess how much Lefferts offered?
$10,000.
$40,000. Thomas Edison, by making that one strategic mistake in the negotiation, would have given up $35,000. A lot of money now. It was a lot more money then.
Wow. And we tend to undersell ourselves, don't we?
Be strategic about it.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes we do. Sometimes we do, which means we've got to do our research and our homework to figure out who usually makes a first offer, who doesn't, what are the advantages, disadvantages, why is $5,000 fair or reasonable? I mean, if Lefferts is going to increase his profits by $10,000 a month, maybe $40,000 is not aggressive enough.
Yeah.
By the way, Edison simply said to Lefferts, "Thank you very much. I think that's fair."
Well, your Edison story triggered in me my very first negotiation tale. And I was, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old. It was a Saturday morning growing up with my big family up in Seattle, Washington. And I was mesmerized watching the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner hour cartoons on TV. And my dad was taking, some of my older brothers off to baseball practice or whatever. And he was selling my sister's blue Schwinn bike. So he says, I'm going to be gone for a couple of hours, Park. This gentleman and his daughter are going to come by to look at Melody's bike. And would you go ahead and just do the deal with them? And I said, well, sure. And I was kind of half listening as I was, mesmerized by what Bugs Bunny was doing on TV. And I said, well, what do you want for the bike? And my dad says, well, we want 14, but we'll take 10. That's in dollars.
Oh, my gosh.
We want $14, but we'll take 10. This was a while ago. So that was lodged in my brain. And sure enough, about a half hour later, I'm there by myself watching TV and I hear this knock at the door. And I'm thinking to myself, who in the world could that be? And I get up and sure enough, here's this stranger and his little girl there to look at the bike. And it all comes rushing back to me that, oh yeah, that's right. This guy's going to show up to buy Mel's bike. So we're looking at it and I could see the little girl and she jumped on it and her eyes were like lit up and you could big smile on her face. I mean, you could tell she just wanted this bike. And so you could also see the dad reaching for his wallet and he goes, well, what do you want for the bike? And you know what I said, Marty? I said, we want 14, but we'll take 10. And as soon as I said that, I knew, oh, I don't think that's how you negotiate. And that guy was so cool. He just smiled. And I think he appreciated the cuteness of the situation. And he says,
I gave you 14.
No, he didn't. He says, I'll give you 12. So he split the difference. And, to my dad always told us, he said, a deal is only good if it's good for both parties. So I guess that guy was kind of reflecting that too. It was good for him. It was good for us. But yeah, that was my very first try at negotiation. We want 14, but we'll take 10. Oops, I don't think I was supposed to reveal that hand at this point.
Well, and you know what? If the lesson you learned at 7 years old or so is that I need to think about the negotiation before I do the negotiation as to what information I want to share and what information I don't want to share, that is an absolutely crucial part of your homework before you pick up the telephone. Yep. I can't tell you how many people I've been sitting down at that negotiation table and they blurt something out, and not necessarily, their bottom line, but some other information of strategic value that they really didn't think about. And all of a sudden, you can't put that genie back in the bottle sometimes, right? You can't kick them under the table and take it back. It's gone. It's out there. It has changed the other side's expectations. So, you got to prepare.
And you have to, rule number 5, control the agenda. So
that's exactly right.
How do you do that?
Well, when do you want to have that conversation? Where do you want to have that conversation? Do you want to do it in person? Do you want to do it by email? Do you want to pick up the telephone? These are all, again, strategic and tactical components that you need to think about before the negotiation, and then you need to implement it in the actual negotiation itself. And a lot of examples, you come up to a deadline. How are you going to act? How are you going to react? What are you going to do in that context? Do you want to spend the first part of the negotiation with a little bit of rapport building, with a little bit of storytelling? How do you really want to engage? From a tactical perspective, it's a crucial part of the negotiation process.
Also, when you're trying to control that agenda, does it come down to the actual meeting? Like how much you want to talk versus them? Do you want to go first? Do you want to let them go first? Does it come down to like just the actual steps of that conversation?
Yeah, sometimes it does. In fact, sometimes we bring in a written agenda into a meeting. The interesting thing in many ways is that oftentimes if you go into a meeting and someone brings in a written agenda, what do? We look at it and we say, okay, We don't really think that all of a sudden they may have already developed a significant strategic advantage just by thinking about, well, let's see, let's spend the first 30 minutes talking about this, and then the next 30 minutes we'll do this. I once helped this guy sell a small high-tech company, and we flew, there was the team of us that was working, we flew to New York. Well, one of the things we found out is the potential buyer, the day that we were meeting, it was his birthday. Did our homework, did our due diligence. So what did we do? Well, the first 30 minutes of the meeting, we had ordered in cake. And by the way, we found out what kind of cake he liked. We had ordered cake, and we used that opportunity to just get to know each other a little bit before the formal start of the meeting. And I tell you, creating that right atmosphere and really illustrating to the other side that we did our homework had a significant impact on our ability to sell it at the price that my client wanted.
Do you ever feel something like that could come across looking manipulative to them?
Yeah, in that context, I don't think it was manipulative, but you did put your finger on something that's very, very powerful and important, which is in all your negotiations, you really need to be sincere and real. Sometimes we think about this as a game, and I don't think that's the right way to frame it in your own mind. It's really about getting your interests satisfied and getting the other interests for the other parties at the table satisfied. So you've got to be very, very careful that it's not perceived as manipulative or unethical. So for instance, I may do a little bit of research on LinkedIn and find out that the two of us both went to University of Wisconsin-Madison for college. All of a sudden, we've got some ability to build rapport. I may mention that in an initial conversation. On the other hand, if I go onto their Facebook page and I find out that they have, 3 kids under the age of 10, you're not going to start out and, oh, I noticed you've got 3 kids under the age of 10, right? I mean, that's freaky.
Mm-hmm.
That's wrong. That's like
Stalking.
stalking someone,
Yeah.
right? So you've got to use your common sense, your good judgment, and be real in how you communicate and engage, because that sincerity, that realness will come across and show that you're doing your homework and your due diligence, and you're not just being manipulative.
And even preparing for this interview, I was going through your work and your books, and I noticed then that you had taught at ASU. I didn't know that before I did my work, and I thought to myself immediately, well, there's a connection point we have. We both have taught at Arizona State University, and I like, when I find that connection point, I like to throw that out right at the top of the show so that even you and I have something in common, and I think it just opens up the conversation that much more.
I agree 100%.
One last thing before we take a quick break for our sponsor, and then I want to come back and have you talk about the real Trump deal and what you learned in the writing of the book and some of what our listeners can take away from his negotiating skills. It occurs to me yesterday, we were at, me and my creative director that I work with here were at a meeting for a potential new client out in North Scottsdale. And they had interviewed a number of different agencies and people to help them with their brand work and whatever, and hadn't quite found, I guess, the right firm. Well, we went out with no presentation. And so this was our negotiating skills, but it wasn't intended. Our only strategy here was, let's get acquainted. Let's see if they want to work with us and we want to work with them. So we had no pitch deck. We had no presentation. We were just there to take copious notes. And we told ourselves on the way out, let's let them talk for 90% of the time, unless they're asking us pointed questions, because we'll learn so much in that process. Well, they did, and great people doing really fabulous work. And then, we would pop in here and there with examples that would connect their vision of the world and their brand with experience that we've had with other brands doing the same type of thing. And Marty, I can tell you, after 90 minutes of that, they basically said, okay, let's get started. Let's go. When's our first meeting? And I was like, we haven't even given you a proposal or a price yet.
Right.
And the guy goes, oh, yeah. I said, why don't we pull together a letter of agreement and scope of work and put some pricing to that so that we're all on board on what's going to happen and for how much? And he goes, yeah, I think that's a really good idea. So I did that today and sent it off. But it was so powerful because they were like, well, let's get started.
Boy, Park, what you did was an exact implementation of that first golden rule that we talked about 20 minutes ago, right? First golden rule, information is power, so get it. Build that rapport, get that information, find out their interests. Your goal for that meeting, which is an agenda control element, I just want to get to know them. We're going to take notes. We're going to ask questions. Let them talk for 90% of the time. Absolutely crucial. You didn't go in trying to sell. You didn't go in with a pitch deck. You didn't go in trying to argue and convince and persuade. You went in asking questions, actively listening, finding out their interests, their needs. Absolutely classic negotiation in that environment. Never even got to the offer concession stage of the process, and they were already committed by the end of the meeting. I had a similar experience a number of years ago. I went into a negotiation. I asked them one question. Now, you probably asked more than one question, but I asked one question. And for about 20 minutes, the other guy just talked and talked and talked and talked. And by the end of that session, he thought I was the greatest thing since sliced bread. All I did was ask him a question and sincerely and in a real way listen to what he had to say, reflect back on what I heard. And in fact, that relationship started out on a really positive note, and that's absolutely crucial. Biggest mistake that most salespeople make when they go into a negotiation is they perceive it to be about convincing and persuading. Effective negotiators ask at least 2 times more questions than others. Effective negotiators ask at least 2 times more questions than others. I suspect in your conversation yesterday, you asked a lot more than 2 times the number of questions that they did.
Yeah, and why has it taken me 58 years to figure that out, Marty?
You haven't read my book.
When I was growing my ad agency, you're in there and you've got your pitch deck pulled together, you have your examples pulled together, and you're in there just saying, here, let us show you why we're your best choice. And it's the exact wrong thing to do, I've learned.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I've done a lot of work with people in sales, people in purchasing, and business owners, and the most successful ones are very powerful. They make connections with people. They ask questions. They find out needs. They're not threatening, and they really have an ability to connect through stories and through other mechanisms, questioning techniques, listening techniques. They're able to connect with people and get that type of information, and you're 90% there.
Wasn't Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People? One of his rules in there was just that, just listen, listen, listen. And he says, You'll sit down with people and let them go on and on and on. And when it's all said and done, they'll say, my, you're such a great conversationalist, even though you've said nothing. They've done all the talking.
Or they may feel, as your clients did yesterday, you get me. You understand where we're coming from. And when someone is hiring someone to help them, they need that validation. They need to understand that you understand what they want to accomplish, whether you're doing it from a branding perspective, a consulting perspective, or helping them buy or sell a company.
Well, what I'd like to do is take a quick break for our friends at Sendable. And when we come back, I would love to cover the book and what you found in the writing of your book, The Real Trump Deal, an eye-opening look at how he really negotiates. I think we can all learn from that. So let's cover that right after this. Do you struggle pulling good content from your clients for your online storytelling? Do you wrestle with getting it scheduled for publishing and having to constantly reformat it for all your different channels, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and others? Do you get lost in the metrics and finding easy ways to demonstrate your online storytelling success to your clients? Well, you're in luck because Sendable can rid you of all of that. They will help you simplify your content marketing and provide you with all of the tools you need for powerful social media storytelling. And this is storytelling that converts customers, ignites smiles on the faces of your clients, and demonstrates your true worth to the growth of their brand. In fact, it's so powerful, Sendable will make you look like the hero in this whole thing. even as you place your clients and their customers at the center of the stories you tell. We here at the Business of Story are among more than 3,000 digital agencies around the world who rely on Sendable for all of our digital storytelling. And you can too with our special Business of Story offer. You can now get 30% off the Sendable Traction Plan. Just go to sendable.com/park30 and start freeing yourself from cumbersome content marketing with simple online storytelling that sells. All you got to do is visit sendable.com/park30 and start your traction plan today. Oh, one more thing. I wanted to remind you, or to actually let you know if you are a new listener here, that my brand new book, Brand Bewitchery, is coming out in June. I am so excited. It's been about 6 to 7 years in the making. I wrote it way back when, didn't publish it because I wanted to proof it out. And so I spent the next 5 years after that first edition proving it around the world, working with brands, with businesses, with leaders. And then about 1.5 years ago, you know what I did? I rewrote the entire thing. And now it is filled with the proven techniques and anecdotes to show you how it is working in action. And you can use it to do 3 primary things. The first thing is to truly understand and appreciate how storytelling is the most underutilized yet powerful asset in business today. It will also teach you how to dial in your brand story so that you can get crystal clear on what you stand for, so that you stand out in a crowded, noisy market and really connect with your audiences, captivate them. Plus, you will learn the proven storytelling techniques and frameworks that I have been using, everything from the and, but, and therefore to the 5 primal elements of story to taking you by the hand through the story cycle system. All of this is meant to help you become a more confident and compelling communicator, using story to nudge the world in any direction you choose. So I hope you'll check it out. Pre-order your book now at businessofstory.com/brand bewitchery, or you can order it on Amazon, both in print form, Kindle form, and coming soon to Apple iBooks. Check it out, read it. Let me know how your story comes together, and I am eager to hear how you go out and bewitch the world. Welcome back to the Business of Story. Park Howell here with Marty Latz, one of America's top negotiators and negotiating coaches, learning so much in this session. Great fun. So, Marty, tell us about the Real Trump Deal book. What spurred it, and what did you learn in the writing of it?
You know, I started researching and writing the book shortly after Donald Trump got elected president. And the reason was that he was elected in part on the public perception that he was this fantastic deal maker, incredibly successful business person. Of course, he had written The Art of the Deal, best-selling book in the early 1980s, and it occurred to me, and I'd read that many years prior, but it occurred to me that no one had ever really analyzed or evaluated whether or not Donald Trump was as good a negotiator as he said he is. And so what I did is I analyzed his 45 plus years of business negotiations and his first years as president. And I said, okay, here's what he did, and here's what we know works based on the experts' proven research. And let's match it up. And let's figure out if the strategies and tactics that he's used really are supported by the experts' proven research.
And so what did you find?
What I found was, and by the way, most people don't tell people what they did in their negotiations, right? You do a negotiation, you get it done, you move on. Nobody knows what happened. The extraordinary nature of Donald Trump in part lies in his complete transparency since the early 1980s in terms of what he did, what he said, what moves and tactics and strategies he used in his negotiations. One of the things I found, for instance, he's been involved in over 4,000 lawsuits. in pieces of litigation in his business career. That's like over 90 a year. Well, we have the evidence in those depositions, in those lawsuits, as well as in his public interviews with people. We know what he did. So here's the bottom line in terms of his success or lack of success in the negotiations. In the early 1980s, early on, Donald Trump did some excellent deals. Really, really creative, very aggressive. When he redeveloped the Commodore Hotel, which is now the Grand Central, the Hyatt right next to Grand Central Station, a very, very balanced, strong deal, strong negotiation skills. He did his homework. He worked through parties' interests. He got some extraordinary provisions in that deal that no one had ever even asked for, much less received. When he did Trump Tower, again, he took advantage of the timing of that. He was a young guy, but he was extraordinary in terms of his ability to have a vision and implement that vision in Trump Tower. Again, very, very successful. But then he ran into problems in the mid-1980s. He became a celebrity. He stopped doing his homework. He stopped doing his due diligence. He overpaid by millions and millions of dollars for the Eastern Shuttle, which became the Trump Shuttle. He overpaid by millions of dollars for the Plaza Hotel in New York. He would have had to almost triple the room rates just to pay the debt that he took on when he bought that hotel.
So you're saying the ego took over and he says, I can do no wrong, so I'll just go in and do a deal. It's just going to work out?
And he stopped doing his homework. He just stopped doing his homework. He got caught up, I think, in not only the celebrity, but what people were saying about his deals. In fact, he spent so much money and overpaid for so many assets that by April of 1990, he owed $3.2 billion to about 32 financial institutions that had loaned him money. Of that, he had personally guaranteed $833 million of it, personally guaranteed, and an independent financial analyst hired by the banks found that he was worth a minus $297 million. And it was largely because of his unsuccessful negotiation skills that he found himself in that horrible financial condition. But he then negotiated a very good deal with the banks because he was, at that time, too big to fail. They realized they could throw him into bankruptcy, but then they would get a lot less than they might get if they allowed him to try to sell all of those assets that he had purchased in the 1980s. So they gave him a $60 million line of credit and said, you got to go sell everything.
Is that a negotiation? Was that out of good negotiation or out of just pure necessity on behalf of the banks? That they got in such a hole with him, they literally had no choice.
Well, they did have a choice. You always have a choice. It was just a really, really, really bad choice.
Yeah.
And they had a really, really bad alternative. And Donald Trump knew it. In fact, and this goes to the ethics that obviously we've been discussing as a country ever since he was elected, his ethics in this context. He had that $60 million line of credit. So one of the first things he does is he writes a $10 million check for his divorce settlement with his first wife, Ivana Trump, which was explicitly a breach of his agreement with the banks. But he understood leverage because he told his colleague who told him, don't do it. He said to him, why not? What are they going to do to me? And he got away with it.
What from that book will be one of the biggest learnings that come from it for a reader?
I think I would say probably two, one positive, one maybe negative. The first thing is one thing that really Donald Trump has always had in his favor from a negotiation perspective is he's had unbelievably aggressive goals. Other developers, other casino operators, other political candidates would never, ever have really felt that he could accomplish X. But you know what? Donald Trump felt he could accomplish X, and in some instances, he actually was able to accomplish it. Right? I mean, Trump Tower, no other developer was going to do something like that. He had a vision and he accomplished it. Running for president, no previous political experience. He decided to do it, and lo and behold, he won. Right? So his really aggressive goals, I think, on the positive side, were very, very powerful. On the negative side, I think perhaps the most important element, and if we just talk strategically and not ethically, but strategically, what very clearly comes from the book in almost all of his negotiations starting in the mid-1980s, he just doesn't prepare. He just doesn't do his homework or his due diligence. He does this so instinctively, so intuitively. Now, he says that his instincts are amazing, are incredible, but the evidence does not support that statement. You have to do your homework. You have to do your due diligence. You have to go online and find out a little bit about your counterpart before you pick up the telephone, before you engage. It's just not something that you can do. Even if you've got very good instincts, you're going to be a lot better if you do your homework. And the evidence really shows that Donald Trump just doesn't do his homework in a lot of these cases. You take a look at, for instance, his meeting with North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un. Really didn't do his homework, and at the end of the day, he gave up in that first meeting some concessions that he really never should have, and he got very, very little in return. And it was because he didn't really truly spend the time with his team to comprehensively prepare and understand the history of the negotiations. He felt that by virtue of his personality and his individual connection that he could make with Kim Jong-un, that he could overcome some of the history, but in fact he didn't do his homework, because if he had, he would have realized that no matter how much of a personal connection he might make, that he wasn't going to get North Korea to do what he wanted them to do, at least not in the short term.
You know, and it's funny, as you were talking about the positive side of his unbelievably aggressive goals, so bravado and the ego that plays into that, isn't that really kind of just the opposite side of the same coin? On the negative side of it is that he doesn't prepare. He just thinks, I've got this. I'm instinctive, I'm intuitive, I'm really good at this, so I don't need to prepare, which plays right into that idea of these aggressive goals.
And it makes it worse in a lot of cases.
Fascinating. Well, Marty, I really appreciate you taking your time to be here. Do you have 1, 2, or 3 insights that our listeners could leave with right now, on top of all the wonderful stuff you've already given us, that they could be thinking about in their very next negotiation?
Yeah, let me share what I call my 2 pearls of wisdom. I finish all of my training programs with these 2 recommendations. Number 1, prepare, prepare, prepare. The legendary UCLA basketball coach, John Wooden, said, failing to prepare is preparing to fail. Failing to prepare is preparing to fail. But don't just prepare on the facts. Don't just learn the facts, the information. You also want to prepare on the process, the strategies, the tactics, the negotiation. Second pearl of wisdom, works 100% of the time. Protect and preserve your reputation. Your reputation as an honest, ethical, credible, professional negotiator. Not only is it the right way to negotiate, not only is it the ethical way to negotiate, it's also the most effective way to negotiate.
Throughout this, when I was thinking about it, we had talked when we were off air about your brand. I think I've got your tagline, Marty. Marty Latz, arguably America's #1 negotiator. See the pun there?
Sounds good to me. I love it.
Thank you so much for being here. I mean, really a fascinating show. Again, where can people learn more about you and buy your 2 books?
Just go to latznegotiation.com, LATZ negotiation.com. There's also a lot of free resources on that site, including over 100 columns that I've written, free advice on the negotiation process. Lots of videos there too.
Invaluable free advice right there. So, well, thank you. Really appreciate you taking the time today to be with us.
Thanks for the opportunity, Park.
thank you for listening to The Business of Story. If you liked what you heard today and you've got some friends or colleagues or clients or customers, someone who is coming on a big negotiation, working through a presentation, whatever it might be, please feel free to share this episode with them. Tremendous amount of great advice here. And of course, go to Marty's website and take a look at that free advice there as well. I learned so much today. It's just been an absolute pleasure. And if I can be of service to you, visit me over at businessofstory.com, where I too have some free tools, tips, and techniques there for you to craft and tell compelling stories that sell. And of course, don't forget our good friends over at Sendable. If you want to really be publishing, converting, and measuring the impact your stories have online, go to the Sendable tool. We use it here at the Business of Story, and we absolutely love it. Until next Monday, when we will have another guest here for you like Marty that will help you excel through the stories you tell. Remember, though, that the most potent story you will ever tell is a story you tell yourself. So make it a great one, and thanks so much for listening.